Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this short video on health and safety in preparation for your Unit 1 exercise. One thing I want to emphasize, archaeology is fun. It's an absolute blast, but safety must always come first. So please don't feel overwhelmed when we talk about all of these different safety measures that are important in the field, but they are very, very important to talk about, and we're going to address those a little bit right now. And I'd like to start by talking about OSHA. OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is the part of the United States government responsible for making sure that everybody works and operates in a safe workplace. For archaeology, this means a lot of the same rules as you see in the construction industry, particularly Regulation 29 CFR 1926, which has to do with digging trenches safely, making sure that if trenches or excavation squares are dug deeply enough that they are shored up and shielded and protected. If you're working in archaeology or the CRM field, and at any point you think that there may be an OSHA violation, you should call 1-800-321-OSHA to report that violation. And this brings us really to our first area of safety, which is trenches and excavations. First thing you should do before doing any digging, or any responsible principal investigator should do, is call 811 or 1-888-DIG-SAFE. This is a free not-for-profit clearinghouse that will come out a few days before you start digging, whether you're digging at your home for a construction project or literally anything on your property, and we'll go out and mark electric power lines, gas lines, communication lines, water lines, sewers and drain lines, and make sure that your excavations are not coming down on any of these things. The last thing you want to do when you're excavating is come down on a power line or gas line, which can be very frequently not that far under the ground. The other thing that you want to do when you're digging is, if you dig deeply enough, you want to shore up your excavations, as these individuals have done here. You do not want, if excavations reach the point where they could potentially collapse onto a person, then they need to be properly shored and shielded. Think, for example, of these very, very blatant OSHA violations that you see in archaeology. In the picture, I don't want to even think in the picture on the left what might happen to this individual working underneath that giant rock that might collapse onto him at any moment. So you need to make sure that if you're digging deeply at any point, that you shore up your excavations properly. You also need to make sure that you never sit on the edges of an excavation either, because you might knock down the bulk, destroying precious information, or accidentally knock something down on somebody working below you, which is always which is always something you want to avoid. I would highly recommend, I think the most comfortable and safe thing, bring some sort of padding, like literally like a yoga mat or something like that. Lay it down next to the excavation and then lay down on your chest on that yoga mat. That evenly distributes your weight, so your chances of collapsing the bulk or the edges of the excavation is virtually nil, and it's also a heck of a lot more comfortable as well. Some archaeologists end up working with heavy equipment to peel back layers of plow zone or other parts of earth that are unimportant to excavation. When working in and around heavy equipment, make sure that you have on an orange or yellow safety vest. This should especially be the case if you're working in an urban area where there's traffic. Wear your hard hat. If you're operating the machinery, make sure that you have hearing and eye protection. And if you're working in and around the machinery, be aware of that machine's blind spots. You shouldn't be working directly next to the blade, or behind or immediately next to the vehicle if you can avoid it. This also goes for hand tools. Here you can see some of the archaeology trowels we use. Never use a garden trowel. They will point at you and laugh if you come to an excavation with a garden trowel. Always bring a mason's trowel. Sometimes we have to use things like axes to cut down trees or machetes to clear brush. You want to make sure that there's never anybody behind you. You want to make sure that you operate them safely, avoid blisters, take a break if you need to. Always look around before you swing. And if you have your trowel, you need to keep it sharp so you can properly trim the side of your excavation, but make sure that it's always in a safe place. I've actually had the experience of one of my fellow excavators placing their trowel down on their chair and then sitting down on the pointed end of their mason's trowel and ending up with a perforated behind. So something you generally want to avoid. There are also weather-related risks. Very often we excavate in the summertime, which means we need to protect ourselves from extreme heat, sunburn, and sunstroke. You should always wear sunscreen. You should always wear a big, floppy, silly hat. The bigger and floppier and the more ridiculous looking in general, the better it will protect you from the sun. If you're going to be working outside for an extended period of time, some sort of sun covering or umbrella is always a good idea. Because sunscreen, while it'll protect you from burning, will not protect you from the dangers of solar radiation and skin cancer. And always just make sure that you stay hydrated as well. Bring bottled water with you. I'm going to say why bottled water in a minute. And make sure that you stay hydrated when you are out and working. Other things that we encounter in the field, especially in New England, are insect stings and bites, especially ticks. Lyme disease is no joke, and I've known many an archaeologist who have succumbed to it. At the end of your excavation day, when you get home, before you step in the shower and you wash off all of that dirt, check yourself for ticks. Check in and around your hair, your ears, under the arms, around the waist, all over. If you have a very close friend or partner who's willing to look you over, please make sure that you do that. Also, if you happen to be allergic to bee stings or wasp stings or anything like that, make sure that you have your EpiPen and that your dig director or principal investigator is made aware of your allergy. Okay. Also, diseases in the field. Stay up to date on your immunizations and your vaccines. This is very important, especially for tetanus or the DTaP or Tdap vaccine. You can get tetanus from being cut on rusty metal, and not a huge surprise when you're digging excavation trenches, especially in historic sites. Rusty metal is always an option, so stay up to date on your vaccines. Also, remember how I said bring bottled water? Never drink from streams, untested wells, or other natural sources of water. Bring bottled water with you because you never know what might be lurking inside. Also, plants. No, leaves of 3, let it be. Avoid poison ivy, poison sumac, and poison oak. You should also know and realize that the roots of poison ivy, poison sumac, and poison oak are just as bad as the leaves. So if you're excavating down for that first few layers until you get underneath any layer of poison ivy, wear gloves and protect yourself. Bring a medicated scrub. I, as principal investigator, always make sure that I have a medicated poison ivy scrub with me. Also, don't say, oh, I've never had a problem with poison ivy, I'll be just fine. The thing about poison ivy is that you do not build up a resistance to it, but rather you build up a sensitivity to it. The more exposed you are to poison ivy, the worse it's going to be. Okay. And then last but not least, I know it says 7 there, it should say 8. Last but not least, just because you're not in the field, because you're in the lab, doesn't mean that you have to disregard safety. There are all sorts of safety issues when working in the lab. Sometimes we work under fume hoods or with things like tannic acid or acetone or other chemicals. Always make sure you wear eye protection and gloves when using these materials. Additionally, sometimes, before you go out in the field, make sure that your principal investigator has tested the soil. Sometimes there can be dangerous chemical hazards in the soil from chemical spills and the like that sometimes go undocumented. And historic graveyards also can be dangerous because prior to 1910, arsenic was the key ingredient in embalming fluid. So that can sometimes seep into the soil. So always make sure that your soil is tested before you go out into the field. Despite this, remember, archaeology and work in the field is fun, but safety always comes first.